This meeting is being recorded. So hi, everyone. I'm Colombe. I'm one of the co-founders of Atlas, and I'm super psyched to be having this conversation today with John. As I just mentioned before the start of the recording, I've been cyber-stalking him the whole day, and unfortunately reading a bit too much what he's been written. I mean, unfortunately, because it's a bit creepy, but it was very interesting.
Only the whole day? You should be spending your whole life on this.
I was going to expect you to say something like, maybe it's a bit too much, but yeah. I'll improve, I'm sorry. Just to put this discussion in context, at Atlas right now, we're doing something which is we're running consultations on what democracy should look like, on what governance should look like. So we're involving people from now over 130 countries to talk about the issues with democracy today and try to, learn from best practices, think about solutions, also just vent quite a bit sometimes, but that's okay, and try to come up with a better framework. And so we focused a lot on, for example, disinformation. We talked about the issues with the UN. We talked too much about crypto. We talked about a lot of different topics. But we haven't really talked about the role. I mean, we talked about participatory democracy, but not yet really about the roles of citizens as a whole. And how do we shift the narrative? How do we restructure a messed up system and so on? And that's when I thought of inviting John to speak about it, and for a very specific reason. And I'll introduce him at the same time for those of you that shamefully don't know John yet. John is used to work in ads. It really surprised me when I learned this, as he doesn't have the typical personality of the people I've met in ads before. And then shifted to trying to make the world a better place somehow by using his super cool set of skills to shift the narrative from us being consumers to us being citizens. And he wrote a really, really cool book about it that I highly encourage you all to read. Yes, exactly. It's called Citizens, which is not a big surprise, but is a great title. And my favorite topic in there that I'll touch upon is Taiwan's digital democracy model and how it enables citizens to basically impact change, which is really cool. And so I wanted to bring him in to understand how do we shift the narrative from consumer to citizens in democracy and in governance as a whole. I'm done speaking, almost, I promise. Just to set the rules of the game, raise your hands, interrupt me, ask questions, I'll relay them. We're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about what is a citizen story, how does it impact the world today, democracy, governance, and so on. And I'll try to fit in your questions at those different moments, but don't hesitate to interact. It's open-ended and it's an open conversation. And I don't expect John to have answers to every single question I ask. And first question for you, though, to get started, for those that will be watching this that don't know yet about the citizen narrative and the citizen story and the citizenship, can you explain the difference between what you consider to be the consumer story that we often live in versus the citizen one?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, basically, I think the way I see the world, I see it through the lens of actually three stories. I talk about the subject story, the consumer story, and the citizen story. And the way I think we tend to imagine our societies and how they work is that we occupy many different roles all at different times, and we sort of move seamlessly between them. So we're students and teachers and parents and employers and employees and citizens and consumers and voters, and that we can sort of move between all of those different roles pretty seamlessly. And I come from a bit of a different place. The way I see it, actually, at any given time, in a sort of historical sense, there's a dominant story. One of those roles sort of sinks beneath the others or rises above them, and comes to infuse all of the other different roles that we play with that single logic. And so when I talk about the consumer story, the citizen story, the subject story, I'm talking at that level. And what I'm arguing really in the book and in all of my work, I talk about the idea that, I mean, it's a quasi-historical shift. So until the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, for quite a long time, the dominant story was something like the subject. And so in the subject story, the right thing to do, the logic that shows up in all of those different roles that we play, is a logic that says the right thing to do is to keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that the God-given few who run society know best, and they will lead us to the best outcomes of society as a whole. And that story kind of collapsed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and after the two world wars, we more or less deliberately, more or less consciously created what I call the consumer story, and increasingly sort of spread it across the world. And in that story, the right thing to do is to pursue self-interest, to choose the best option for you from those that are offered, on the basis that if everyone pursues self-interest, that will sort of magically add up to collective interest and produce the best outcomes for society as a whole. And in that historical sense, what I'm arguing really is that right now, I think just as the subject story fell apart before, the consumer story is falling apart now. And the joyful thing, the hopeful thing, is that what's emerging in this time, and has been present in humanity throughout its history, is the citizen story, which says that actually the right thing to do isn't just to keep your head down and do as you're told. It isn't just to pursue self-interest. Actually, the right thing to do is to get involved, to contribute your ideas, energy, and resources to the pursuit of the best outcomes for society as a whole, because all of us are smarter than any of us, and that is how the best society will result. And I think, and so just to bring this into the context of democracy, like, there wasn't really such a thing as democracy in a subject story. The subject story is a story of kings and empires more than it is a story of democracy. In the consumer story, you have consumer democracy, where people's role is to choose between the options that are offered to them, and where we're encouraged to make those choices on the basis of our self-interest. So our agency is limited to choosing between options. And in the citizen story, the emerging future that I think we could be stepping into, that is there for us right now, is a citizen democracy where actually we all have a role, not just in choosing between the options, but in shaping what those options are. And the last thing I'll say on this is just to say, I do think that is happening, and I think there are examples from all over the world. You've already alluded to Taiwan. But I also think that the subject story is raising its head in dramatic fashion right now. And I think seeing this moment in time through the lens of those three stories, saying consumer democracy is failing, in that context, the subject story, the rise of authoritarianism, the collapse of democracy is a very real possibility. And it is also a very real possibility that democracy might evolve and deepen and become something much richer and more dynamic. But it's all in play right now.
So thanks for the explanation. And I'm already getting questions in the chat. So I'll give the mic to Martin in just a second, actually, to ask his question. First, to dumb it down to my level, let me take popular culture references. So if I understand correctly, in the consumer story, we're basically in the matrix, where you're given the choice between a blue and a red pill, and you choose, right? Because you don't shape the choice. You're giving you're giving two choices, and like, take one or take the other. That's it. In the citizen story, it's more like Star Wars, right? Like, you join the revolution and you shape this. Sorry, that's my way of understanding society a lot of the time. I grew up with too many of those movies, but you kind of shape the revolution, right? You join, you decide what action you're going to take, you discuss it together. It's kind of like a citizens' assemblies in times of war. You fight back for democracy, for freedom, for rights. Is that a correct?
May the force be with you. I'm down with that reference completely.
I'm glad I understood it. I give them my
I mean, another little metaphor that sometimes works for people is it's like the subject story is a kind of is in food terms, the subject story is where you walk into somewhere and you're given like gruel. The consumer story, you walk into a buffet and you can choose from many of the options, but they're all basically like not that healthy or not that wonderful. In the citizen story, you get in the kitchen, right, and you get to like be part of creating the thing, not just choosing between what to consume.
That makes complete sense. Martin, I'll let you ask your question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm still laughing about the Star Wars comparison. But before I ask the question, also, thanks so much for Atlas for hosting this. This is awesome. John, first off, my question is going to be a little bit more about the transition and how to make it happen. And I do find this analog that you also say, even in a lot of your work, to say, hey, like we already had this transition from subjects to consumers. And therefore, it's definitely possible to move from consumers to citizens per se. But the question is more so, what is the best force for building that story in itself? because there's a lot of different ways that you can accomplish it, right? Like some of it is narrative building. How do you build the story and how do you tell the story to where it captures people's attention? But also there's other ways to do it as well. There's through specific action, which seems like that's a lot of what you're advocating as well. But I'm thinking about like if there is there like a palette of opportunities that you can do to build the story, what are the leverage points that you see?
What a great question. So maybe let me just pick off a couple of little bits of it because I think there's a lot there. Firstly, just to come to the thing you referenced, that the story has changed before. Like we did move from the subject stories to the consumer story, and one of the things I like about I find joyful and kind of opening about seeing things in this way is that it stops you from just seeing where we are as like as ultimately kind of negative. It's like actually the consumer story, consumer society from what came before was actually a liberating shift, and it lets you be a bit more kind of generous to the people who've tried their best to be good for the last 50, 60, 70 years from within that story. So, and I want to emphasize that. I think also it brings a kind of a slightly scary thing with it, which is the last time the dominant story of society kind of fell apart, we had 2 world wars before we could make a new sense. And like if we're really honest with ourselves, and I think it's very healthy to be honest. Like we live in a time when a next world war is a very real possibility, and I think it is in part because I think it's largely because the certainty that's offered by a stable story is falling apart. And I think that's what happened at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th as well. That said, I like, don't get me wrong, I don't think that's inevitable, and I don't think that's the best way for the transition to happen, as you put it. I mean, maybe to bring in the Taiwanese example that Colombe referenced, because this is where I draw most of my inspiration for how this transition might happen. I think a lot of you are involved in Atlas will know about Taiwan's digital democracy. Just for those who don't, very briefly, there's a whole kind of crowdsourcing of policy that's pretty normal in Taiwanese democracy. The sort of culmination of it, the pinnacle of it, was during the COVID crisis. Taiwan's response was characterized by the 3 principles: fast, fun, and fair, and essentially involved crowdsourcing the whole response, including setting up phone lines where anyone could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better. And it was arguably the most successful COVID response anywhere in the world. The important thing to your question, though, Martin, is the backstory behind that and how the Taiwanese government changed its approach. Because 10 years ago, that wasn't the direction of travel at all. And so, and 10 years ago, the government was very much in the consumer story. It launched a thing called the Economic Power Up Plan, and essentially said to its people, like, don't even try and get involved. We don't need you. And in response to that, what happened was that a hacker movement called GovZero started outside of government. And they called themselves GovZero because they were creating parallel websites to government websites, all with the URLs g0v.tw. And they basically envisioned and created a sort of a shadow state, essentially, initially as an arts project. But then when a big protest moment came, the Speaker of the and protesters occupied the Taiwanese parliament. The Speaker of the parliament actually endorsed the protest, and the protesters were using GovZero tools to make the trade bill. And in that moment, the story of the relationship between citizen and state shifted dramatically. And that, I think, and please ask me follow-ups on this if you want to, but that, I think, is a very exciting example for us to stare at more, and it's one that I'm looking at in a lot of detail. I think this idea of accepting a reality that the political systems that we have in this moment in time just aren't up to dealing with the challenges of our time. We can't fix a climate emergency, a geopolitical crisis, a crisis of inequality from within the existing political systems and structures, I don't think. What that means is that, what the Taiwanese can inspire is that what we can do is start to imagine and create other political structures, and try and do that with the active participation of existing politicians, and then try and bridge into those different systems. And I think that work of maybe the best way to express it is that I love the Buckminster Fuller quote. Buckminster Fuller was a mid-century American architect and designer, and he had his wonderful phrase. He said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, create a new reality that makes the existing obsolete." And I think that's the really powerful work in this time, kind of the work of imagination, building community, building new ways of making decisions, and leaving the door open to the existing systems and people in positions of power to step into those, and where possible, doing it with them. I hope that makes some sense.
I think that makes perfect sense. I know Martin has follow-up questions. I'll give you the mic soon. And I just have also 100 follow-up questions before that. I'm so happy you started touching on Taiwan, because actually my next question was going to be, can you give us practical examples of a shift from consumer to citizen story that have happened and led to change somehow? And you already mentioned a bit Taiwan with, you mentioned Taiwan with Gov0 and so on. An example I always love, just because I'm French, and the legalization of Uber in France was a huge mess. I remember, at the beginning you had to ride in the front of the car with the driver, because otherwise they would get, their cars would get destroyed by taxis and so on and so forth. And I remember reading about Taiwan and using participatory democracy techniques, digital democracy techniques, and so on to bring in taxis, insurance companies, Uber drivers, citizens, and being like, okay, we're going to find a consensus on this. We're going to work together. We're going to gamify it, and we're going to make it work. And they actually managed to adopt, I think, 7 out of 10 proposals with like 80% of support or something like this. And it worked really well. So you already kind of gave Taiwan as a best practice of something that worked. Do you have other examples? The reason for which I'm asking is not just, oh yeah, citizen stories can actually work, but I think it's very inspiring to hear. I know in the call we have Clive, for example, who's a member from Kenya, who always spread a lot on our Kenyan channels, the Taiwan example as a potential way forward across the world, and a way to like aspire to change society across the world. So do you have any other you want to share of like best practice that have inspired you as crazy?
I mean, loads and loads of different types. Since you mentioned Kenya, my favorite, one of my favorite stories is the work. I don't know if Clive has heard of, has worked with Kennedy Adede and the guys at Shofco, Shining Hope for Communities. But that's an organisation that essentially started in Kibera, which is a slum of Nairobi, with a group of people just coming together and deciding to take their agency and shaping the community of which they're part. Starting with a football match essentially, and then clearing up streets, and has evolved over the years to become an organisation that now runs girls' schools and medical clinics and all these sorts of things in slums across Nairobi and indeed across Kenya and beyond, I believe. And even had the gumption to establish an event that they called the World Communities Forum, I think in 2021, where they hosted self-leading community organizations from all over the world to discuss how they were transforming their own communities. And Kennedy in particular is a really powerful voice, challenging the sort of the what I would call the consumer paradigm in development, where development is sort of done for communities rather than led from within communities. And Kennedy's become a major sort of voice of a very different approach to development. He's also known informally as the mayor of Kibera, which is quite a fun kind of reference point. So that's from a kind of bottom up perspective, in the most and in the hardest of circumstances. Like I can't overemphasize to you how tough the start that Kennedy had in life was. Like to the extent where he watched his best friend get stoned to death as a street kid. Like we're talking from kind of nothing. But then maybe flipping the lens to a different place. One of my favorite stories of the transformation of the politics of a country is in Ireland. And I think not like 2 years after the Brexit referendum in Britain, there was a referendum on access to abortion in Ireland, which legally, and where the population voted by an overwhelming margin, something like 66% of the population voted to legalise access to abortion up to 12 weeks. And that proposal and the decision to change the constitution such that that was possible was developed by a citizens' assembly, by 99 randomly selected Irish citizens coming together to deliberate and hear from witnesses and discuss the issues for 5 weekends over 5 months, 2 years before in 2016. And that process has not only kind of unlocked a major issue in Irish politics, but it's actually set a major precedent. So there's now a standing citizens' assembly in Ireland that's always looking at a different issue on an ongoing basis, and has recently made a recommendation to change the language of the Irish constitution on gender equality, and there'll be a referendum on that change coming up in the next year or so. So it's not even so much the individual example as the sort of the fact that when systems start to go into these spaces, they tend to stay there. And that I think is really powerful. I mean, look at France at the moment. For all the kind of, it's a really interesting case. There's all the protests and the upheaval, and at the same time, like arguably from Macron taking a very kind of authoritarian, like just imposing a particular thing. At the same time, they've held a process on the end of life, which has brought together 184 citizens, I think, randomly selected, deliberating for a very long period and coming to some really powerful recommendations that are now at the heart of a much more constructive national conversation. So we can see this. Again, I just expressed this tension between the stories that are in play in this moment in time, and everyone's wrestling with them. But what that does mean is that there's huge opportunity, I think, huge creative opportunity to build and develop and prototype and show what might be possible, because the old ways are definitely broken.
I completely agree with this. So as a disclaimer, I'm receiving a lot of very specific questions via direct message from Joburg, Colombia, and so on how to solve specific issues for citizen stories. And I'm loving this. I'm going to keep it to the end, because first I want to discuss broader systems when it comes to democracy and governance, but I will ask all of those questions or give you the mic to ask all of those questions just a bit more towards the end of the conversation so we can cover some basic concepts. So we've spoken about Taiwan, we've spoken about citizens' assemblies, we'll get back to this. And so to rephrase the conversation, we're talking about the role of citizens in democracy and governance, right? As I said, I spent too much time today cyber-stalking you, and I found an article you wrote a while ago, John, on rapid democracy. And I actually never heard about this before. I'm not an expert when it comes to democracy, but I've researched quite a bit of participatory democracy tools and so on, and I've never heard of it. So can you maybe explain to everyone what it is and how you think it refocuses everything around citizens, and whether you think this could be a potential additional tool to use, for example, at the national level or even regional levels and so on, to change the story?
Okay.
Good luck. Yeah, 30 seconds. No, I'm kidding.
So rapid democracy. So the reason you haven't heard of it before is because I invented it.
But I should definitely have heard of it. It's
no. Well, so the inspiration for this came from, and actually it does tie into the previous question that got me started talking about Taiwan and how we design for these moments when the story might shift. This framework of rapid democracy is something that we've been working with at New Citizenship Project to try and figure out how we might construct these moments. But the original inspiration actually comes from corporate decision making, actually. So the rapid originally is an acronym that was proposed by Bain Consulting as a way of diagnosing a problem in how businesses make decisions and when businesses go wrong. And what they said was that businesses tend to go wrong when too many of the roles in a decision-making process reside with too few people. So oversimplify it, and you're sort of saying when the chief executive decides everything and then just tells everyone what to do. That goes wrong because there's not enough diversity of input into the decision, and there's not enough legitimacy of the decision once made. And so, and I, staring at that, reading about that, I was like, well, actually, that you can see a pretty direct analogy to democracy, right? Like, there's arguably there are too few people with too much holding too many of the roles in the democratic decision-making process. All we get to do, back to this consumer democracy thing, is choose our representatives, and often not even that effectively. And then those elected representatives do all of the rest, kind of for us and largely without us. And so I started staring at the RAPID framework and the RAPID acronym and thinking about how you might apply it to democracy in such a way as to kind of think about the phases of a decision. So if you took the RAPID acronym in chronological order, it would actually be ERDAP, which wouldn't be as catchy. But the idea is that essentially it runs, the 5 phases are input, recommend, decide, agree, and then perform. And so what we've started to work with is the idea that if you could apply and draw on different participatory tools and approaches in different ways at each of those phases, you might actually be able to involve people really powerfully and really dynamically in big decisions as relate to a society. So, and the first big experiment we've done with this is on a campaign in the UK called the People's Plan for Nature, where we've worked with 3 of Britain's biggest conservation organisations to help them hold the space for a big participatory democracy process. So I'll use that to kind of illustrate the 5 stages quickly. So the first phase, the input phase, what you want at this stage is you want ideas from everywhere. You're not looking for a representative sample, you're just looking you want as much diversity of input to a decision as you can possibly get. And so in this phase, what we did with the People's Plan for Nature is we put out an open call for stories and ideas from all over the country, particularly looking to understand what community groups of all shapes and sizes were doing everywhere across the country. That produces but also asking academics and gathering a set of experts who could see the question of what to do about British nature from different angles. So that's the input phase, ideas from everywhere. You can imagine kind of loads of different tools being used for that. The next phase, the recommend phase, is one that is really about, so in the Bain work, they talk about the people who are going to be most affected by the decision should be represented in the making of the recommendation. And so this, in our view, in the People's Plan for Nature, this is a really good role for a citizens' assembly. This is a representative sample of the public coming together to really get under the skin of it and be able to make the recommendation. But the important thing to emphasize is that they're not actually making the decision still, they're making the recommending a course of action. And that's what we did on People's Plan for Nature. 100 randomly selected people, representative of the UK population, 4 weekends over 4 months, created a set of recommendations that we called the People's Plan for Nature and have published recently. The next step is the decide phase. And the really interesting thing here is that this can still be a role for elected representatives, but this is really the point where, in the Bain literature, they talk about this being the point where you commit the organization to a direction. The actual moment of decision isn't the input and the recommendation and all of that. It's just the moment of commitment. And it is really important that some specified person or group has accountability for that commitment. They have the ultimate decision. And so in the People's Plan for Nature work, what we're doing is now, sort of having got to these recommendations, looking to sort of ask governments, the devolved administrations, Scottish, Northern Irish, Welsh and English, to step into those recommendations. But we've also made sure we've created recommendations that are relevant to local government, so that councils can be the decision makers on whether and when they adopt those. We've also made recommendations that are relevant to community groups, so the decision makers are actually the community groups. So it's all about kind of knowing who the decision maker is that is actually making that commitment. Then the agree phase, the A, is actually the sort of speak now or forever hold your peace sort of moment. And the interesting thing when you think about our democracy today is that actually the agree phase is probably the only one where we do actually have a vaguely functional process, which is consultations. But what you recognize when you think of that as an agree phase is that they're actually after the decision has been made. Consultation is only suitable to be a kind of make sure we haven't missed something massive moment. It's not suitable as an input gathering process. It's not suitable as a recommendation process. But we will be in the People's Plan for Nature, if these recommendations get adopted, we will be pushing for there to be consultation phases. And then finally, you get to the perform phase. And the idea is that if you've involved people in the right ways at all these different phases, then you actually have much greater buy-in. And so people much more willingly kind of get involved in the actual implementation of the decisions. So, but this here still, you can support it with participatory approaches. So what we've done with the People's Plan for Nature is set up what we've a matched crowdfunding scheme where there's £1 million coming from a corporate partner actually, which will be there to match and support community-based crowdfunding to enable to sort of accelerate more community groups to do more of what they're already doing. And so just to like sum up and kind of look across the board and maybe refer back to one or two of the other examples, the rapid process or what I think it does is it helps you see that if you involve the right people in the right ways, the process of making a decision might actually take a little longer, ironically, for the acronym. But once made, that decision has far greater buy-in and won't get unpicked, and therefore ultimately the decision making is quicker and more rapid. But if you can see it, so we've sort of drawn this out and then applied it in lots of different places, but and are starting to apply it in lots of different places. But I think you can also see it in some of the best examples from around the world. So if you think about your Taiwan example of the crowdsourcing of the regulatory framework on Uber, that was essentially a kind of rapid process. They used Polis, the app, the open source software Polis, as an input gathering and a recommendation forming process. And then it was still over to the elected representatives to actually commit the nation to adopting those regulation principles. And there was still a consultation phase and so on. If you look at the Irish example of the referendum on abortion, that there was a sort of open conversation in the nation. There was then the Citizens' Assembly that developed the recommendation on to open up the legalization of abortion, access to abortion, and then it still went to the decision makers to the elected decision makers to approve that recommendation, and then they put it back to the nation, and the referendum actually was a kind of agree phase. So there's so much to say on this, and you could sort of probably spend a 2-hour thing on this alone, but I'm excited about it. And I think what we're trying to do with the People's Plan for Nature in particular is see if we can, it's an experiment in trying to create a moment analogous to that moment in Taiwan when the Speaker of the Parliament endorsed the protest. And the reason for that is because David Attenborough is doing a big documentary series at the moment. There is a national conversation about nature, and what we're trying to do is meet that conversation with a participatory process and see if we can conduct electricity and attention into the idea that there's a different way of doing democracy and invite our politicians to step into that.
And I love this. And I'll comment briefly on one thing, and then I'll take one last question on the topic of democracy before moving to global governance. I think something that I often get as a question when talking about, for example, citizens' assemblies or rapid framework like the one you mentioned, or the Taiwanese one, is, okay, but what happens after we contributed, right? Like, we spent all of this time, all of this energy, it's not always compensated and so on. What happens after? And I remember asking Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan, do you have, like, is it binding? Because for me, in general, my conception of thing is, if you ask me to participate in a legitimate process, the decision should be binding. And she told me, no, but look, what type of politicians would we be if then we didn't accept the results, right? Like, we would get thrown out of power. That clearly doesn't happen everywhere. You know, the climate convention in France did not result into all recommendations being implemented and so on. But I thought it was also a very good response that I wanted to point out. I'm going to jump on Sean's question, and I'm going to link it to another one just to make it harder on you, John. Sean is asking whether citizen-centered democracy could disproportionately reward citizens with the most free time to sink into shaping their governance, and in this way possibly become an engine for magnifying privileges. And I think that's a very good question, because I've seen, in volunteer organizations, for example, when you enable and when you create systems like this, often it is people that have most times that get to participate more, and as a result shape most organizations and processes. I'm going to link this to a question I wanted to ask you, so you can choose to ignore a part of it if you want, which is on permanent citizens' assemblies or fourth branches of governance. And I think I mentioned this to you recently. There's a South Korean think tank that is working on the idea of replacing basically the second chambers in a lot of countries. So for example, the Congress or the Senate, into a sortition-based chamber that would have specific competences. So for example, looking at longer term issues, would rotate very often so that people can still have a life, a job, and so on, would compensate them, and would basically be a counterweight to elected officials that too often become oligarchs because they accumulate too much power and money, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to ask you whether you think, very long question, let me try to make it more simple, whether you think, for example, having either permanent citizens' assemblies where randomly selected citizens are compensated for their work, or fourth branches of government, could kind of counter the issue that Sean is mentioning, which is the more time you have, the more power you have at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is I think that the situation Sean describes is pretty much what we have at the moment. So I'll give you an example that in the 2019 local elections in the UK, there were more men called John or David elected than there were women in total. And I think the idea of that at the moment those who have most time are those who then stand for election and are able to play those roles and therefore take a lot of that power. I think that's exactly the situation we have at the moment, and that's part of why I think and I can see why you link the questions. I think sortition is a very powerful antidote to that. It's also part of why I think the rapid framework is very helpful, because I think I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that there are some people with time to spend on these things. What we just have to be very careful of is that doesn't result in inappropriate power in the decision-making process. So for example, in the rapid process, the input phase is totally open to those people to spend more time on it if they want to. When you get to a recommend phase, you need to be thinking about representative samples, sortition-based recruitment, random selection and that kind of thing. But I think thinking about it in terms of what role are people playing in the decision-making process is a really important one. As I say, I think at the moment, what we've probably got is not a problem of people's privilege being accentuated because they're overrepresented in an input or a recommend phase. I'd argue they're overrepresented in the decision-making aspect. Like privilege is being accentuated in who gets elected, and that's actually even more of a problem. What I think to come into the specific kind of proposal of fourth branches, and I mean, I do think that standing citizen assemblies, permanent citizen assemblies, and networks of assembly structures across a society, which I know is what Claudia Schwalis and the team at Democracy Next, if people want to check them out and learn more about them, I know is what they're working on at the moment, and I'm most excited by, like, what would it actually be to have a series of assemblies looking at different issues that were kind of networked together into the governance of a place. I think that's very powerful. I think Paris having a standing citizen assembly as part of its governance structure in much that sort of way, that decides the theme for 100 million euros a year of participatory budgeting, that can commission issue-based citizens inquiries into different issues. That's a hugely exciting and very powerful innovation. I guess what I want to say is that I think we need to be open that there may be different ways of doing these things. I think one of the approaches that I'm learning most about at the moment is in Brazil, the tradition, the fairly long history of what are called national policy councils, where it's not entirely randomly selected, but there are some measures taken to ensure representation, but there are distributed conversations across the nation that then build towards a national point of view and feed into national policy. all of this it's been building for a while. All of it stopped under the previous president for reasons that to many of us will be obvious, but is kind of restarting again now. And I think the one thing I worry about sometimes with the sort of the Standing Citizens Assembly as the I think it's a very powerful thing. I think we need to be exploring it. I think we also need to keep our minds open that there are many different approaches and deep histories of democratic practice that come from different traditions around the world, and we need to learn from and build on all of them. And one of the most powerful experiences I've had over the last year was I was lucky enough to be in New Zealand at the end of last year, and I spent a bit of time with Maori communities and leaders of those societies, and was hearing about sort of quite deep traditions and heritage of participatory decision-making processes. There's this summed up in this word papanoho, which I'm going to say, I'm sure I've said horribly wrong. If there's anyone from that background listens to this or wants to let us know, but this basically, the word literally means the meeting place between the two hulls of an ocean-going canoe. But what it metaphorically means is the collective intelligence process of that happened in that space when, after a storm or whatever, all of the group would come together in that meeting place and draw on the different wisdoms, the one who best understood the stars, the one who best understood the currents, the one and decide from a sort of storytelling, collective intelligence building process where to go next. And so I guess what I'm saying is, in short, like, I think there are a couple of really powerful approaches that are beginning to cohere, and I think sortition-based recruitment for upper houses is absolutely number one among them. I think it's incredibly powerful, and I think that I think it does go some way to solving some, and certainly is better than some of what we have now at solving some of the challenges Sean's raising. And I still think that we need to stay in an uncertain, learning, experimenting, figuring out space. The most powerful thing I take from the Taiwanese story is the spirit more than anything else, and particularly the spirit of the way they responded to COVID. They effectively said, they were openly said, we don't know how to deal with this situation. But what we do know is that we'll deal with it best if we tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. And I think we should do what we can to bring that spirit to everything we're facing at the moment. The moment we become dogmatic is the moment we're going to get stuck.
Oh my God, I have so many follow-up questions, but I have to move to governance. And I just wanted to mention, for everyone who's following the conversation and is not aware of all of the organizations that John is mentioning, I'm trying to add all of them in the chat with the links. So then next, People's Plan for Nature and so on. I'll also add it in the caption of the video that I'll post, so you'll have access to it. But feel free to ask me as well if I missed any, so that I can add the links. I really wanted to ask you about politicians as facilitators versus leaders and so on, and bouncing on what you just said of, we should be able to tap into everyone's knowledge, expertise. The more brains come together, the better normally. But I unfortunately have to move on if we want to talk a tiny bit about global governance. So global governance is one of my favorite topics, including because when normally I say I really want to have a way of dealing with global challenges through a global government, everyone looks at me like you're going to create a type of Star Wars situation where you have like a big empire that controls it all and is so centralized and so on and so forth. I don't believe that has to be the case. I believe you can try to create new system of governance with new democratic systems at the same time, and try to question how existing organizations like the UN and so on are run to change it and to involve more citizens and to create a more democratic world, etc. And I know that you thought a bit about how to crowdsource, involve citizens, etc. at a global scale. So I was wondering, because a lot of those processes are often tested at the local level, right? And sorry, I'll mute Calypso and new participants. And a lot of processes are often tested at the local level. So do you have ideas or suggestions of how those might be tested at a global level, how we might involve and give agency to citizens, for example, within the UN or within any global organization that seeks to be democratic?
Yeah, I mean, so the thought experiment that I put forward in my book and kind of have played with a bit, and I actually think is possible is I'm particularly attracted to thinking at the level of constitutions, and I think if we think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a kind of constitution for humanity, I think that's really interesting. It's sort of I think of constitutions as sort of the rules of the game, and I think it could and should be possible to refresh and renew the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a constitutional exercise using a load of these processes and tools in a genuinely global way. I mean, the first thing I'd say is if you haven't, I would definitely check out the Global Assembly, which was an experiment in holding a global citizens assembly that was focused on climate. And what they managed to do was use NASA technology to identify 100 randomly selected points on the planet, guided by population distribution, and then find a person nearest to each of those points, and then provide a translator and a sort of iPad and these sorts of things, the tools that would enable them to be part of the deliberation. And they've essentially proved that you could do a citizens assembly process on a global scale. And with a globally represented group, I think, and so with that as one part of the process, and then applying this kind of rapid framework, I think it's possible. Like I can imagine, like if we took the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as it currently exists and said we paid absolute respect to its importance and its significance as a baseline, but then we said, what if we were to evolve this? What could make it even better? How might we, like, what input would we get? Let's open to input from everywhere. Again, in the spirit of the rapid process, let's use a global citizens assembly to then prioritize it. Let's then put it out to a kind of a referendum type or consultation type process around the world. It's not perfect, but I think in terms of global governance, for me, that idea of the role that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights could and should play as a sort of basic contract of humanity, I think is a really fascinating intervention point. I'm not pretending I've got that perfect in any way, but I think I think if we could get there, because the problem, maybe this is where I'll go a little bit, but one of the ways I'm expressing this to a lot of people in positions of power at the moment is saying, I don't actually think this is, 5 years ago, I would have been talking to them about these sorts of approaches as a nice to have, as a kind of like, you should evolve this, you should make your processes better because it will make them more legitimate. Now I'm saying to them, I think there's an existential case for you doing this. Like, the legitimacy of the existing systems is falling apart. Like when I talk to, I often hold up the Taiwanese protest moment back in 2014 when students and protesters occupied the Taiwanese parliament and GovZero brought their tools in, and contrast that, and what they were doing at the time was demonstrating a new way of doing politics, and contrast that with the January the 6th riots in America, and say basically these systems that we have are not able to deal with the scale of the challenges we face. If the choice we have is not to defend the status quo or lapse into authoritarianism, the choice is to lapse into authoritarianism or embrace an evolution of our democracy, and there isn't a sort of defend the status quo option, I don't think. And with that in mind, I think like the UN is rapidly losing its legitimacy, just as the League of Nations did before in the run-up to the Second World War, right? Like this thing isn't working anymore, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't have the power it once had. And so accepting that reality and saying, how can the only way we will breathe legitimacy, I would argue, back into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is to give people meaningful agency in shaping it. And if we don't, then it will fall.
I agree. So instead of doing the follow-up questions, I'll give the mics to people. I just wanted to mention one article that John wrote, as I said, too much cyber stalking done today, about following Zelensky's example in involving citizens. So for me, when I was thinking about global governance and a citizen story, there's always the question that comes when you tell people about this. Well, in times of crisis, when you have to make very swift decisions, how does it work, right? Like how do you do it? And you gave, and I just posted the article in the chat, by the way. And you wrote this article explaining that, there are a few things that could be done, for example, such as EU or Germany or the UK running participatory democratic processes on how to reduce gas consumption using the Taiwanese softwares and so on. So I think there's a lot of practical recommendations that you give in this article that might be of interest to people here on, and for me, this is kind of global governance, right? It's countries coming together and having to respond to a crisis and to a global challenge. And how do we do it in a way that actually involves citizens and is not just, a few leaders making decisions. But I'll let you answer to that. And at the same time, I'll give the mic to Martin, who wanted to ask something about social media platforms and the role in shifting the narrative. I don't know, John, if first you want to answer to what I said, but like this, I can mute myself.
All right, awesome, thank you. So just, I'm very curious to hear, especially given your background in advertising. John, you talked about Polis and you talked about different tools that help with the decision-making process, but what's the role that you see in social media vehicles, particularly even existing social media vehicles, or even social media vehicles that are less so framed around consumerism, but framed first with this lens of citizenship at their core? What role do you see in these sort of vehicles in this transition?
I'll try and be brief because I'm sure you want to get some other stuff, but it's a huge conversation in of itself. I think there's two quick things I would say. One is that I think when the tools we create, we embed values and stories into them. And what the social media platforms that we have at the moment have arguably been created with the idea of people as consumers, and therefore have been created as marketplaces that treat us as consumers and treat us as consumers of each other. And that, I think, is actually the underlying problem at the heart of almost all of what's wrong with social media at the moment. I do, however, think that the concept of social media, the concept of peer-to-peer communication, is obviously essential to the evolution of our societies and the evolution of democracy, if it can be harnessed and designed from and built from within those stories. So I'm really excited by the possibilities that I'm seeing emerge in some of the new platforms and so on. Just to bring it back down to earth, one example I would really point you to look at, I've just been talking to some people involved in the Soul movement in Colombia. Soul stands for self-organized learning environment. And these guys talk about themselves as true social media. And their main thing is they do these pop-up Soul labs, which are essentially a sort of a fairly small space with a satellite connection and roughly five computers. Each of the five computers has a big screen, and this is what makes them call it social media, because multiple people are using one computer to find out to direct their kind of mutual learning. And these Soul labs are kind of spreading all over Colombia, right, as far as I understand it, and really kind of inviting people into their collective agency. And I think that is a really interesting take on what we mean by social media. So, like, one to look up, an unsatisfactory and short answer, but I like where you're going.
Amazing. Thank you so much, John, for answering this. I can't find the link to the Soul Lab, so I'll post it after, but so that everyone can have access to it. I also shared again a video we did with Taiwan on Taiwanese democracy and the role of social media in having conversations. Audrey Tang said something like, having a conversation on Facebook and trying to come to a conclusion is like having a drunk conversation in a club and trying to vote on a budget. And so I think it's also the question of what social media do you use? Perfect. John posted the link of Soul Colombia. It's which social media do you use and for which purpose, not just, can social media help us in shifting the narrative? I unfortunately have to close here because the Zoom is going to end. But thank you so much, John, and everyone for making the time. I love this conversation. And as I said, we're running consultations, and actually we have a few members here, including Philip, that are running the process and facilitating the discussions on what should democracy look like and what should global governance look like. And it's really cool to be able to think about it as well from a almost philosophical approach as well. And what type of society do we live in, and how does the narrative control the democracy we experience every day? So I'm very thankful for it. I'm very thankful for all of your comments, participation. I'm sorry I didn't get to ask John how to solve all of the issues of Johannesburg and Colombia. I thought it might be a bit much. I received those questions in private. I might send them as a follow-up via email, John, and you will get to answer it and I'll post it. But thank you so much for taking the time again. And I'll leave any closing word of hope, anger, or anything you want to John.
Oh, I think there's one thing I want to make very clear before I end, which I've maybe misled slightly on, which is while I think the existing political systems aren't up to the task, I think there are a lot of very good politicians, and I think those people are key in this moment, because it will be them who open the door to these ways of working. And so and the reason I emphasize that is that sometimes I see these conversations cropping up and being shaped as if all politicians are bad, and I think that's a really unhelpful place to be. And then the last thing I'll say is just I really love I think all of this work has to start from a place of faith in humanity, and what I've sort of taken saying is like, try and remember in everything you do that it's not the humans that are broken, it's the stories that we're trapped within at the moment that are broken. And seeing how the stories, the consumer story has made so many people try and be good within that story, and then feel deeply threatened by the fact that it's failing, and know that there are a lot of people hurting a lot at the moment, and that is where a lot of the damage is coming from. And if we can do that, then we can speak to those people from a place of acceptance and invite them to be part of building something much better, rather than sink into kind of fights. And so the question I always try and end with, and always like try and start my days with, is like, what would you do in this time if you really believed in everyone around you, if you really believed in them, and you tried to invite them into the best of themselves? So yeah, that's enough.
That's very inspiring. Thank you for this. Thanks everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.